Energy is the most important and the first 7% of our economy. Without a strong energy policy, and let me describe what that means. That means energy that is available 24/7, energy that can build factories and reshore manufacturing. That means affordable energy where people can afford to pay their utility bills and have access to gasoline vehicles, hybrid vehicles, and electric vehicles, choices that consumers can make. This is a world that almost all Americans would like to live in.
Hello and welcome to Energy 360, the podcast from the CSIS Energy Security and Climate Change Program. I'm Quill Robinson, standing in for Lisa Hyland. This week, we look at how U.S. policymakers can balance the development of the United States' energy resources with its climate goals. Joining Joseph Majkut is Mary Landrieu, who represented Louisiana for more than 15 years in the U.S. Senate. They discuss the future of natural gas, the emerging consensus on nuclear energy, and strategies for durable, bipartisan lawmaking. I'll turn it over to Joseph now to kick off the conversation.
Senator, thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to the Energy 360 podcast.
Well, thank you, Joseph, and I really appreciate you including me, and I mean that because it really is an important subject for our country and the world, and, we've really got to talk through it in a way where people can make decisions about how they want to shape this new future of ours, and there are lots of opportunity, and it's exciting. It doesn't have to be doomsday and scary. It can be exciting and hopeful, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your optimistic vision. Before we dive into the future, maybe we can start with a brief look back. You served in the Senate representing Louisiana from 1997 through 2015, and you chaired the Energy and Natural Resources Committee right at the end of your service. Since you've left, you've continued to be involved in energy and climate issues. So I would love your thoughts looking at that whole time period. What has changed? How have these issues evolved? And then what does that mean for how we should be thinking about them going forward?
Well, that's an excellent question. And everything has changed in the last 25 years. Now, this is going back a little bit more than 25, Joe, but in the 1970s, America and Americans were desperate to think we were going to run out of energy. We were going to be held hostage by OPEC. We were going to have to pay exorbitant prices. They're high today, but they're not exorbitant at the gas pumps. All that has changed because in that time, particularly starting in the 80s and 90s, Americans just got to work and found more energy resources. And I mean that. The government leaned in, but it was the private sector, the shale revolution. Our business leaders went to work and found the energy supplies that America needs, not only to power itself, but to help our allies all over the world. So now we are truly in an era of energy abundance, traditional energy, hydrocarbons, fossil fuels, less coal, although we have a lot of it. We're using less of it because the other thing that's changed in a very good way is that we're much more conscious of the negative impacts of greenhouse gas emissions on our planet and the warming aspects of our planet and how that causes real problems everywhere around the globe. And so we are taking really amazing steps to reduce our emissions. New technologies are developing. And just recently, and I'll end with this, there's now been a complete 360-degree turn on nuclear energy, which I'm so happy to see because it's a zero carbon emission. So those are just three examples of how the world has changed dramatically in a positive direction for the United States and the world.
So let me jump in then and ask, have these issues, I completely understand how actually positive the situation looks. But it also feels that these issues have gotten more partisan over that period. As you've observed the politics of these issues, been in the arena, trying to work with colleagues to develop solutions, am I right to say that it has gotten more partisan? Or was that sort of a blip and now we're seeing a lot more bipartisan progress moving forward?
You are correct. It has gotten more partisan in the sense that, let me go back into the time of abundance where we started finding more energy resources. That was welcomed by both Democrats and Republicans. We both celebrated that we didn't have to rely on OPEC. There was a great celebration of the American energy abundance.
Just for timing, is this like sort of the late 2000s, early 2010s?
Yeah, well, really the 90s, 2000. And then when the Inconvenient Truth came out and the work of the environmental left and the environmental middle explaining, while this was great and terrific, good for our economy, good for our economic strength, there was damage truly being done to our planet. That's when the divide started to really happen and people got into their corners. The Green New Deal versus drill, baby, drill. And everybody's familiar with that polarizing and non-productive conversation. So what I like to talk about and do spend most of my time talking about is the center of that argument that, yes, we have a crisis on our hands, an environmental crisis or challenge, but in every challenge, there is opportunity. And if we look to see how we can reduce emissions, be grateful for our abundance of hydrocarbon energy in this country, be grateful for our 136 years supply of natural gas, be grateful that we can find oil and gas safely onshore and offshore, but let's focus on reducing emissions, including methane emissions from natural gas. Let's use natural gas to replace coal, reducing our emissions. In fact, the U.S. has led the world in reducing emissions. Let me repeat that. We have led the world in reducing emissions over the last 15 years because we have done more replacing of coal with natural gas, which is 50% cleaner. In addition, we have added tremendous wind and solar resources to our electric grid, which is important to reduce emissions. And now, just last week, the Senate and House are taking action to revitalize our nuclear industry, new nuclear, traditional as well as small modular nuclear, which is zero. So while it is polarized, you are correct. We are working to unpolarize it, like to talk with Republicans about the benefits, economic benefits of clean energy, to talk with Democrats about you can have continued fossil fuel use if you focus on reducing emissions and not eliminating fuels. And we're finding that that center is being built out stronger. I can give you some evidence to support that. So yes, it's polarized, but hopefully in the next few years, it will become less so.
Well, I'm so glad that you brought up that final example of the bill that recently passed Congress with very substantial bipartisan support. I mean, I think only a couple people voted against it on the Senate side. Because if you look as well at the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or otherwise known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, you look at the Energy Bill of 2020, it does seem that there is a growing consensus amongst U.S. political leadership that managing emissions, developing new technologies which will be cleaner, allow for the integration of intermittent renewables onto the grid, create opportunities for vehicle electrification where that works. There is a real consensus around those things that I think is missed when you read the headlines, but has actually been quite important for progress over the last, I'm going to say, 6 years.
Absolutely, Joseph. Yes, you have hit the nail on the head and given some excellent examples of where there's growing bipartisan support. The nuclear bill that passed was broadly supported by both Democrats and Republicans. The infrastructure law was passed with bipartisan support. Now, people point to, well, yes, that's true, but the IRA, which was, a big environmental energy bill, was supported only by Democrats. That may be true. They only had Democratic support. But as you know, they had Joe Manchin's vote, and Joe Manchin carried many ideas and proposals offered by Republicans on his energy committee into that debate. In other words, being more modest with the subsidies for some renewables, understanding the importance of investing in carbon capture and sequestration, understanding the importance of hydrogen, all colors of hydrogen, from blue to green to pink to turquoise, whatever. I mean, not just green hydrogen. So there's a growing consensus, just what you said. Now, the headlines don't always show that, but I'd like to give credit to many, but particularly our team at Climate Solutions Foundation, led by Chrissy Houlihan from Pennsylvania and Andrew Garbarino from New York. They built the first in many years bipartisan climate solutions caucus in the House. So there are many groups in town in Washington and around the country working to build the center. And the reason this is important, like when people say, well, so building the center on healthcare is important. Yes. Building the center on immigration is important. Yes. Building the center on national security. Yes. But energy is the most important and the first 7% of our economy. Without a strong energy policy, and let me describe what that means. That means energy that is available 24/7. Right. That means energy that can build factories and reshore manufacturing. That means affordable energy where people can afford to pay their utility bills and have access to gasoline vehicles, hybrid vehicles, and electric vehicles, choices that consumers can make. This is a world that almost all Americans would like to live in, I think, and we have to provide that for them. And without a bipartisan work, what happens is the policies swing so far left and then so far right, the business community can't balance itself to invest the trillions of dollars of private capital that's necessary to build and create this future. So that's why I think my work is so important and why I continue to work on it.
And I would add, neither can our partners abroad, whether that's close allies or trading partners. If there's no sense of stability on what American public policy is, that's really challenging for our countries abroad. As you know, consensus has to be built. So this is I'm going to give you my hard question. Here at CSIS, it's our mission to help build a consensus at the middle of American policymaking to improve energy security, respond to climate change, resolve energy injustice. And my hypothesis is that 25 years ago, or just before, when you started your career, there was a really strong consensus around how the U.S. was going to maintain energy security with military deployments in the Middle East and our own production, and that consensus has fractured, as you described, by the arrival of climate change as an issue, the incredible resource availability unlocked by the shale revolution. And I feel that we haven't yet caught a new consensus when it comes to energy and climate change for the United States. So rather than try to describe that consensus, can you help us understand what elements it really needs to address? Because my belief, and you can tell me that I'm wrong, Senator, is that we need a view for the U.S. to be a leader in the 21st century. And that means a leader in terms of energy security, in terms of geopolitics, in terms of technology. And I'm not sure yet if you went around and asked the sort of 40 policymakers in D.C. right at the center, even many of the thoughtful ones, they'd be able to describe what that consensus is quite yet.
I agree with you. And that is the work that's before us. That is an accurate description of where we are. We're in the process of building a new consensus that dissipated over the course of the last, 25 years because of the argument that arose over, oh my gosh, this energy system that we built, this abundance of energy, oh, it's all bad, it's all terrible. We have to get rid of all oil, all gas tomorrow. That argument is not flying with the American people. That's the argument the Democrats or the left wing of the Democratic Party is putting on the table. And the Republicans are recoiling, and I believe correctly, saying that view is not one that we will support. But what the Democrats are right about is that we must address greenhouse gas emissions. And the Republicans said, oh, we want to put our heads in the sand and we don't acknowledge it. Well, let me say the happy news is this. Republicans have lifted their heads out of the sand, led by people like John Curtis and Representative Garbarino and David Joyce and others who were saying, and those are House members, and then I could name quite a few senators on the Republican side, Bill Cassidy, Senator Kramer. They're saying, hey, wait a minute, guys, this greenhouse gas emission stuff is really real and we have to come together. So it's not baked yet. We don't have all the ingredients for this recipe, but there are a lot of good minds and hearts and hands working on this in Washington. And your group is one. Our groups that I represent, Natural Allies, is an amazing organization that was created, just to give you an example, by Alan Armstrong several years ago with Toby Rice from EQT, big gas producer, along with other midstream pipelines like Kinder Morgan and Enbridge and TC Energy. And they said, listen, we're not the bad guys. Natural gas, we want to be a positive solution for climate. And so natural gas is becoming a consensus, like nuclear is becoming a consensus on both sides. And if we can find the right passage or right key with electric vehicles, like not a mandate for all vehicles to be electric by next year, but some kind of choice, options, subsidies on moving to cleaner vehicles, that could become a consensus too. And then the electric grid, where to put these lines. We need more of them, making the lines more efficient. That's also something that both parties could agree to some degree. So, Joseph, those are sort of the big pieces of a consensus, but you're right. And that's what this election in large measure is going to be about.
Well, let's touch on the election in a second. I get the sense that we don't have yet, and I'm not proposing one, a sort of, here is the vision for the United States. But maybe we can dive into an example. You mentioned the work of Natural Allies. I know that you've been paying very close attention to the LNG issue, and in particular, coming from Louisiana, where a lot of the LNG export industry is located. It's an important issue for your state. Ma'am, the Biden administration earlier this year announced a pause on the licensing of new LNG export terminals, citing concerns about the energy security, the cost of natural gas when the U.S. is now such a huge exporter, as well as efforts on climate. Can you help our audience understand where you think that issue is going? And do you think that a pause and review was a wise choice?
I'm on record, as you know, Joseph, being very critical of that decision. It was, in my view, unfortunate. It was a surprise. It was a real shock, not just to our own industry here in the United States. And I'm not talking about just the exporters themselves that are primarily located in Louisiana and Texas. I'm talking about the manufacturing industry that relies on supplies of natural gas. I'm talking about our allies around the world in Europe and Japan, particularly South Korea and other allies that don't have the resources that America has and depends on America for cleaner, cheaper natural gas. So I hope that this pause is truly a pause. The reason people reacted so negatively, broadly reacted negatively, is because it was interpreted as a de facto ban, because there was no timeline, there was no explanation really as to why the pause. And it was sort of described as a political move, which was really just so disappointing. I think it was a political mistake. It was a national security mistake, and it was an economic mistake for our country. So hopefully it will be reversed soon. That could be a consensus of Democrats and Republicans coming together to reverse it, require reduced methane, require cleaner gas, put some requirements on safety, yes, but let this market operate. This market was created by President Barack Obama and Ernie Moniz. It was supported by Al Gore and Bill Clinton. I mean, this is not a far reach for the Democratic base to understand the importance of supplying natural gas to Europe. Their only other choices are Iran and Russia. but we can get back on track. Secretary Granholm spoke at CERAWeek. She indicated to 2,000 people present in the room and publicized all over the world that she thought the pause would come to an end in the end of the year. FERC just put CP2 on the agenda. FERC's an independent agency. Of course, CP2 was the third big facility for Venture Global in Louisiana to be cited. But the bottom line on all this is there are many good exporters. There are many places where we can put export facilities on the coast of the United States, not interrupting communities, but supporting communities and jobs and sending gas around the world to displace dirtier coal, which is what China and India are burning. Coal, dung, wood. We need to get to a cleaner, greener grid with gas and renewables and more nuclear.
Well, and I would say
and better batteries.
And for those who think that coal is on its way out, we are going to be, the recently released statistical review of world energy shows that coal consumption was higher in 2023 than it had ever been before. So it's not clear that the brakes are fully on there. Senator, given that you come from Louisiana, I think it's hard for external observers to understand the implications of an industry, here speaking about LNG exports, that went from practically zero in 2016 to now the U.S. being the largest exporter of LNG globally, 8 million tons monthly coming out of facilities that largely sit in Louisiana. What has that meant for the state of Louisiana? How should a broader audience understand the both opportunities or the challenges that have arisen with that industry?
Well, let me say they're probably equally divided between Texas and Louisiana. Texas's coast is much larger than ours, although we both have large coastal communities. But these are sited pretty well in communities that are not very populated, where there's a lot of land, where there's a lot of space. Well, for one of them is right on the river where, they're LNG. And it's kind of interesting. You can literally stand at the Plaquemine site for Venture Global and watch these ships that are getting ready to export this natural gas down the river. And you can see barges of coal shipped right in front of it. It's quite a sight. And so I'm thinking, not that we want to stop the export of coal, but we want to support the export of natural gas, hoping to get it more to India, yes, and potentially to China. And I know that's a little touchy with some people, but the more we can support India, South Korea, and Japan, the less coal will be used in the world, more American natural gas. And the price has been relatively low of natural gas. Years ago, it was at $10. Now it's $2. I mean, you can hardly get much lower than $2 or $3 for gas, and we can deliver it to Europe for $12 to $16. And it's very necessary to back up solar and wind until we have enough batteries and longer storage, bigger batteries, longer storage, and a supply chain in the U.S. The last thing I think Americans want is to now be completely dependent on China for all of our batteries. People are not going to put up with that. They don't want that. They want batteries built in the United States with materials from the United States, which means we need to mine lithium or come up with some other products that you can use to make your batteries. So Americans want to be American independent. We want to be a global leader in all areas of energy where our partners can depend on us to get cleaner and greener every year, but grow our economy, not shrink it. And it means jobs and economic opportunities. So thank you all for everything that you all are doing to help bring this into focus. But we have got to build a consensus on energy and the environment. And let me say, there are brave members of the House and Senate who are taking arrows from both sides, and because they are trying to find this path forward.
Taking arrows from both sides is our specialty.
Yes, I have experienced that in my life. It's hard to be a centrist, but I'm proud of it and proud to build the kind of compromise necessary. And you're right, Joseph, I'll just say this. America needs to lead. This is made for the U.S. to lead. We are best when we have a big international global challenge We use our technology. We rely on our private sector. Our public-private partnerships are the best in the world. We lead with our private sector, get up and go and roll up your sleeves and get the job done. It's happening in the US from California to New York to the Gulf Coast to the Canadian border. And we can work with Canada and Mexico. So it's a North America challenge, but America needs to lead. And I think we can build this consensus.
Let me pause you there, ma'am, because I think there's a couple things you mentioned that are worthy of taking a moment to discuss. So the U.S., while not a huge source of LNG for China, does export LNG to China. And you mentioned concerns around the Chinese dominance of the supply chain with respect to lithium-ion batteries. Same thing can be said about solar panels. When you think about U.S. leadership in this space, rather, you mentioned the challenge with China with respect to batteries and solar panels and how much of that supply chain runs through China. I'd love your thoughts on the U.S.-China relationship. There are proposals to not export U.S. energy to China that are starting to float around. The policymakers in D.C., as you know, feel a great source of anxiety about our economic and political relationship with China. So how does the U.S. lead in this context when it is the private sector that largely drives our industry and decision-making? And that's kind of our unique superpower. Do you see risks of policymakers sort of overstepping, or how should they be setting the objectives for our strategy vis-a-vis the global energy system and China?
Well, what I would say to my former colleagues, senators and House members, I would say this: there's no reason to hurt ourselves and help China by refusing to send them LNG from the U.S. We make money. They don't. We make money. We are selling a product to them that they don't have and they need. Every time we ship some LNG to China, it puts less pressure on them to rely on coal, which hurts us and hurts the world. And it's basically a raw product. I mean, we're not giving them trade secrets. We're not sending them top level chip manufacturing. So it doesn't make sense to me to block those sort of basic supplies of either crude oil or gas. Now, we need to make sure we keep enough for Americans first. And I understand that. Now, people want to fight with China. Many people want to fight with China, and the American people are upset with China. I understand that. They've dominated our supply chains and they've caused they don't have a democracy like we would hope they would. And people are upset about that. But it's like shooting ourselves in the foot to keep our LNG from them. Now, we want to get it to Japan first. We want to get it to South Korea first. We want to get it to the Ukraine. We just signed a great deal with the Ukraine to provide them gas. I'm thrilled about that. So they can shut off their pipelines to Russia and keep their democracy moving forward in the Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And we have partners in Africa and countries in Africa that want to develop their natural gas resources with our cleaner, better, safer technology, both onshore and off. So, yeah, there's a lot of work to do, but you're right. The consensus that we had back in the 80s, we need to piece it back together and find an American vision that can help lead the world to greater prosperity and a cleaner, safer future for everyone.
Senator, I'd love to ask one more question. It really is about kind of what you see coming next. You've been in this world for a long time. You're a keen observer of the trends. What, from a public policy perspective, do you see coming down the line in the next few years? Permitting reform, things like carbon border adjustments, a new plan for getting American clean energy innovation deployed abroad. Where do you think the most important conversations are happening over the next few years?
Well, they're happening in Washington and all over the country, in small counties and towns and cities. And that, was reflected back up to what members in Washington do. But you're seeing a development of nuclear. Bill Gates's leadership and others is really making a difference on people getting excited about a new consensus over nuclear power, both traditional and small modular nuclear reactors that can be safe and placed in urban areas or safely placed in urban areas to support new data centers and AI centers that require 10 times more energy than doing a search on your phone, as opposed to a Google AI search takes 10 times more energy. People have to realize what they're, asking for. Permitting reform, where it's still a work in progress, preserving IRA tax credits is really important to industry. And I know there are threats to repeal the IRA. I predict that will not happen. There will be threats, political threats, but a lot of the IRA, I think, will be sustained. And frankly, I think Joe Biden's election is important. While he's leaned, in my view, too far left on many of these issues, I think he understands and is committed to rebuilding the infrastructure and manufacturing base of the United States. I think he will hopefully think about modifying and reversing the LNG ban, understanding the importance of getting our gas around the world to help support our allies and national security. I think the growing consensus in Congress, continuing to build those bipartisan coalitions that can move this forward. So regardless of who's in the White House, it's Congress that can act and hold, with the Commerce Committee in the House, Energy and Commerce, Energy and Natural Resources in the Senate, working together to build an American global energy and climate policy that can lead the world to a more vibrant economy, not a shrinking of economic opportunity, not creating more energy poverty, eliminating energy poverty, growing these resources the way Americans know how to do it. And it's an all of the above, focusing on eliminating emissions, using technology and using our universities and our scientists and engineers to help us do that. And it's exciting work. It keeps me going 24/7. And I hope that it excites the people listening to us. And this is the great challenge of the moment for our planet. And we need to roll up our sleeves and get to work.
Thank you so much, Senator. If I can leave you with a note of urgency, by my count, including this year's election, we have 7 presidential cycles between now and 2050. And if our goal is to get to net zero by that time and respecting the risks of climate change, we've got a lot of work to do building that consensus vision for American leadership. And I know you do a lot in that regard. So I wanted to say thank you for your efforts and for joining us today. And we look forward to hearing from you down the line.
Thank you, Joseph, so much. It was great to be with you all. And thank you for your work.
Thanks to Senator Landrieu and Joseph for their insights. The CSIS Energy and Climate team will continue to look at these issues throughout the summer and fall. You can find more episodes of Energy 360 on our website, csis.org, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Follow us on social media for updates from our team. And as always, thank you for listening.